close your eyes and let yourself drift to Paris on a quiet autumn night. The city sleeps beneath a gentle veil of rain, each droplet catching the golden glow of street lamps as it falls onto ancient cobblestones. The air is cool and soft, carrying the scent of wet stone and the distant promise of the Seine. This is Paris at its most intimate hour, 3 o'clock in the morning, when the boulevards empty and the city's true heartbeat becomes audible in the rhythm of falling rain. Let yourself settle into this peaceful darkness, where stories unfold in the spaces between raindrops, and strangers become connected by nothing more than a shared moment of quiet wonder. The traveler's thoughts. She stands at the tall window of her hotel room, fingers wrapped around the cool metal frame, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass. The air carries the scent of wet cobblestones and that particular Parisian dampness that seems to hold centuries of stories within its embrace, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee and fresh bread that drifts up from the boulangerie on the corner below. Beyond the gentle percussion of raindrops against the window, the city breathes quietly in the darkness. The distant hum of a late taxi navigating empty streets, the soft whisper of wind threading through narrow alleyways between ancient buildings, the occasional creak of old wood settling in structures that have witnessed the passage of empires. The Eiffel Tower stands like a distant lighthouse in the darkness, its golden lights diffuse through the rain into soft, warm halos that seem to pulse with the heartbeat of the sleeping city. A cigarette burns slowly between her fingers, forgotten for long moments as her eyes follow the hypnotic path of water cascading down the window in rivulets that catch and scatter the amber light from the street lamps below. The smoke curls upward in lazy spirals, mixing with her breath in the cool night air that seeps through the slightly open window, carrying with it the complex perfume of a city that never quite learns to rest. This morning feels like weeks ago now. The frantic rush through the airport corridors with her overpacked suitcase bumping against her legs, the cramped airplane seat where she'd tried unsuccessfully to sleep while crossing time zones and continents, the first magical glimpse of Paris through the taxi window as afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and amber that seemed too beautiful to be real. The journey had begun months earlier, really, with a sudden decision born from restlessness and a savings account that had finally grown large enough to make dreams possible. She remembers the moment she'd clicked purchase on the airline website, her heart racing with equal parts excitement and terror, her finger hovering over the mouse button for a full minute before she found the courage to commit. Paris had always existed in her imagination as something distant and impossible, a city that belonged to other people. People who spoke French effortlessly and moved through the world with the kind of confidence she'd never quite managed to cultivate. People who knew instinctively which fork to use at fancy restaurants and how to tie scarves with that casual elegance that seemed uniquely European. The decision had been sudden but not impulsive. It had been building for months, maybe years, like pressure in a kettle that finally demands release. Her job at the insurance company had become a series of identical days, each one blending into the next with the monotonous efficiency of a machine designed to process claims and human disappointment with equal indifference. Her relationship with David had ended 6 months ago, not with drama or passion but with the quiet recognition that they had simply run out of things to say to each other, had become two people sharing space rather than sharing life. The plane ticket had felt like a declaration of independence, a statement to herself and the universe that she was still capable of surprise, still willing to step outside the comfortable boundaries of her carefully constructed routine. Her friends had been supportive but puzzled. Why Paris? Why alone? Why now? She hadn't been able to explain it then, and she's not sure she could explain it now. except to say that something in her soul had been calling for this moment, this city, this particular convergence of rain and solitude and possibility. Now, in this suspended hour between night and dawn, the city has revealed its secret face to her. No crowds pushing through metro stations with the urgency of commuters late for work. No tour groups clustering around monuments with their cameras and guidebooks held high like shields against authentic experience. Just the rain and the lights reflecting on wet pavement like scattered stars, and this strange, peaceful solitude that feels like being the only person awake in the entire world. The sole witness to Paris in its most intimate and unguarded state. She thinks of the small cafe where she'd lingered too long over coffee this afternoon. Her guidebook closed on the table as she watched strangers hurry past the rain-streaked windows with their colorful umbrellas and urgent destinations. The cafe had been everything she'd imagined a Parisian cafe should be. Small round tables with worn marble tops, bentwood chairs that creaked pleasantly when she shifted her weight, walls lined with vintage posters advertising long-forgotten theatrical productions and aperitifs from another era. The waiter had been an elderly man with kind eyes and hands that moved with the practiced grace of someone who had been serving coffee and conversation for decades. He'd smiled when she ordered in her carefully practiced but undoubtedly broken French, the words emerging from her mouth with all the awkward hesitation of someone trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. He'd responded in gentle English, but with such warmth that her embarrassment had melted away like sugar dissolved in warm water. He'd brought her a second café au lait without being asked, and when she'd thanked him, he'd simply nodded and said, "Paris is for taking slowly, mademoiselle. The city rewards patience." Those words had stayed with her as she'd wandered the afternoon streets, moving without destination or schedule for the first time in years. At home, every moment was accounted for, every activity planned and purposeful. Here she discovered the luxury of aimless wandering, of letting her feet choose the direction while her eyes consumed the endless feast of architectural details, of shop windows displaying items she'd never seen before, of the particular way Parisians moved through their city with a combination of urgency and grace that seemed to be written into their DNA. There had been the bookshop too, that impossible wonderland of towers of volumes reaching toward a ceiling painted with faded angels and cherubs that seemed to peer down at the readers below with benevolent interest. She'd spent an hour there, maybe two, running her fingers along spines of stories written in languages she couldn't read but somehow understood in the way that all stories speak to the universal human heart. An orange tabby cat had followed her through the narrow aisles, purring softly as it wound between her legs with the casual affection of a creature that knew itself to be welcome everywhere, as if welcoming her to this temple of words and dreams and possibility. The bookshop owner had been a woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose chignon and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She'd watched from behind the counter as her customer explored, occasionally offering suggestions in accented English, pressing particular volumes into willing hands with the knowing smile of someone who could match readers to exactly the books they didn't know they needed. She'd given her a slim volume of poetry, something about night walks through the city, wrapped in brown paper with string, refusing payment with a gentle shake of her head. "For the sleepless hours," she'd said, as if she could see into the future, as if she understood that jet lag and excitement would keep her awake long enough to need such comfort. The memory of the Seine at sunset surfaces now, how she'd stood on the Pont Neuf as evening painted the sky in watercolors of pink and gold and deep purple that seemed to have been mixed by an artist who understood that beauty should sometimes hurt a little, should overwhelm the senses with its impossible perfection. The river had moved beneath her like liquid history, carrying reflections of ancient buildings and modern lovers who leaned against the stone railings, lost in each other and oblivious to the tourist with the wonderstruck expression watching from a respectful distance. She'd felt then what she feels now, a sense of being witness to something larger than herself, a city that has been breaking hearts and mending them again for 1,000 years, that has seen revolutions and renaissance, lovers and loss, the endless cycle of human hope and disappointment played out against a backdrop of enduring stone and flowing water. The bridge had been crowded with people from dozens of countries, all drawn by the same magnetic pull of beauty and history, all seeking their own moment of connection with something eternal and larger than their individual lives. A church bell tolls somewhere in the distance, its bronze voice rising from the stones of the city like a prayer made audible, like the voice of time itself marking the passage of another hour in this ancient place. The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the buildings themselves are singing, as if the city has found its voice in the deep night hours when traffic fades and human voices quiet to whispers. She counts the chimes, 3 in the morning, that mystical hour when the day belongs neither to yesterday nor tomorrow but exists in its own suspended reality, its own pocket of possibility. The rain grows heavier now, drumming against the window with renewed purpose, and she watches a lone figure hurry down the street below. Their umbrella is a small black dome against the glistening pavement, and their footsteps echo briefly before being swallowed by the sound of falling water and the general hush that settles over cities in the deep night hours. She wonders where they're going at this hour, what story they carry with them through the rain-washed streets of Paris, what urgency or joy or sorrow drives them out into the storm. The figure disappears around a corner, leaving the street empty again except for the rain and the pools of light cast by the street lamps, and she feels a strange kinship with this unknown person, this fellow traveler through the night city. Perhaps they too are unable to sleep. Perhaps they too have been drawn to their window by the sound of rain and the magnetic pull of Paris in its most intimate state. The city creates these connections between strangers, these momentary intersections of story and place that need no words or introduction to feel meaningful. The cigarette has burned down to almost nothing, the small ember glowing like a tiny star between her fingers, and she takes one last slow draw, feeling the warmth spread through her chest as she continues to watch the dance of rain and light on the street below. Tomorrow there will be the Louvre, with its impossible collection of human achievement and beauty accumulated over centuries of creation and acquisition. There will be more cafes, more wandering through neighborhoods where every building seems to hold secrets in its weathered stone walls, more attempts at French that will improve with practice and patience. There will be Notre Dame, still standing despite the fire that had broken hearts around the world, still magnificent in its damaged state, a reminder that beauty can endure even catastrophe. There will be the Latin Quarter with its winding medieval streets that seem designed to encourage getting lost, to reward wandering over destination. There will be markets where vendors will smile at her attempts to buy cheese and bread in their language, patient with her pronunciation and generous with their samples. But tonight, Paris belongs to the rain and the sleepless, to the gentle melancholy that comes with being beautifully, completely alone in a city of dreams. She thinks of her small apartment back home with its familiar furniture and predictable routines, with its stack of unread books and its coffee maker programmed to brew at exactly the same time every morning. The life she left behind feels both distant and immediate, like something she can see clearly but no longer quite understands. There's no homesickness, only gratitude for this moment of suspension between worlds, between the person she has always been and the person she might become. Here she is not the cautious woman who checks her bank balance twice before buying a new dress. Not the employee who always arrives 5 minutes early and stays 10 minutes late. Not the daughter who calls her mother every Sunday with dutiful updates about a life that rarely contains anything worth reporting. Here she is someone new, someone who can stand at a window in Paris at 3 in the morning and feel perfectly at peace with her own company. Someone brave enough to travel alone to a foreign city. Someone interesting enough to deserve such beauty. The transformation isn't dramatic or sudden. It's more like shedding a coat that was never quite the right size, revealing something that was always there but had been hidden under layers of other people's expectations and her own fears. The Eiffel Tower's lights continue their eternal vigil, and she imagines all the other travelers who have stood at windows like this one, watching the same rain fall on the same ancient streets, feeling the same mixture of solitude and connection that comes with being alone in a foreign place. The city sleeps around her, but she senses its dreams, dreams of lovers and artists, of revolution and renaissance, of all the human stories that have played out beneath these roofs and behind these windows over the centuries. She thinks of Hemingway and Fitzgerald, of all the writers who had walked these streets and tried to capture something of their magic in words. And she understands now why they had been drawn here, why Paris calls to artists and dreamers and anyone who believes that beauty matters, that it's worth crossing oceans to witness. The city offers no easy answers, makes no promises about the future, but it provides something perhaps more valuable, a sense of possibility, a reminder that the world is larger and more beautiful than the small spaces we usually inhabit. Her eyelids grow heavy as the rain continues its gentle percussion against the glass, and she realizes that she's tired now in a way that has nothing to do with jet lag and everything to do with the deep satisfaction of a day fully lived, fully experienced. The cigarette burns down to nothing, and she finally stubs it out in the small ashtray on the windowsill, the one that bears the name of a hotel that probably hasn't existed for decades. The last thing she sees before turning away from the window is the way the tower's lights shimmer through the rain like stars scattered across dark water. And she carries that image with her as she finally surrenders to sleep, knowing that tomorrow she will wake in Paris, and that will be miracle enough. In her dreams, she walks through streets that smell of rain and possibility, past cafes where the coffee is always perfect and strangers smile at her attempts at French, through bookshops where cats purr and every story ends with someone learning to be beautifully, courageously alone. A letter never sent. Emma sits in the worn velvet chair by the window, a piece of hotel stationery balanced on her knee, her pen poised but motionless above the blank page like a bird that has forgotten how to land. The rain creates a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the glass, like delicate fingers drumming softly on a wooden table, each droplet adding its voice to the nocturnal symphony that seems to rise from the very stones of the city. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower glows through the darkness with an almost ethereal light that seems to pulse with the beating of her heart, its golden illumination scattered by the falling rain into countless tiny prisms that dance across the wet pavement below. The air in the room is cool and still, carrying the complex fragrance of old wood and lavender that drifts up from somewhere far below in the narrow street, mixing with the clean smell of rain on ancient stones and the faint aroma of coffee from a late-night cafe that refuses to surrender to the darkness. The blank page waits with infinite patience, as constant and reliable as the rain itself, offering itself as a canvas for thoughts that feel too large and too fragile to contain within the boundaries of her mind. She had meant to write something meaningful tonight, something that would capture the strange ache of being here alone when this trip was supposed to be shared, when every reservation had been made for two, when every dream of Paris had included another person walking beside her through these rain-slicked streets. The words feel heavy in her mind, each one carrying more weight than it should. Love, miss, remember, wish, forgive, understand. They hover just beyond her ability to pin them down with ink, like butterflies that refuse to be caught and mounted in the neat rows of sentences. The pen feels foreign in her hand, though she has held thousands of pens in her 34 years, has written countless letters and lists and notes to herself. Tonight, it seems like an inadequate tool for the task she has set herself, too small and ordinary for the magnitude of what she needs to say, too crude an instrument for the delicate work of extracting emotion and transforming it into something that could be sent across an ocean, across the gulf of hurt and misunderstanding that has opened between her and the person she had planned to share this city with. Instead of the letter she intended to write, she finds herself documenting the rain. How it sounds different here than it does at home in Portland, more musical somehow, as if the centuries-old stones of Paris have learned the secret of making even weather into art, have discovered how to transform the simple act of water falling from sky to earth into something that speaks to the human soul. She describes the way the streetlights blur into watercolor smudges through the wet window, how the tower seems to float in the darkness like a golden ghost of someone's most beautiful dream made manifest in iron and light. Her handwriting is looser than usual, less controlled, as if the foreign air has relaxed even her penmanship, allowing the letters to sprawl across the page with something approaching freedom. She writes about the little cafe where she sat for hours today, the one with mismatched chairs that had probably been collected from flea markets over decades, with blue-checked tablecloths that bore the faint stains of countless meals and conversations, with a gray cat that watched her from the doorway with knowing green eyes that seemed to understand more about loneliness than most humans ever learn. The cat had approached eventually, after she had been sitting there long enough to prove that she wasn't going anywhere soon, allowing her to scratch behind its ears while she nursed her third cup of coffee and tried to work up the courage to visit the places they had planned to see together. The animal's purr had been a small comfort, a reminder that connection doesn't always require words or explanations, that sometimes the simple act of being present with another living creature is enough to ease the sharp edges of solitude. She writes about the way French sounds like music even when she doesn't understand the words, about how conversations at nearby tables seem to flow like water over smooth stones, rising and falling with a rhythm that made her feel she was eavesdropping on poetry rather than mundane discussions of work and weather and what to have for dinner. There had been the young couple at the table by the window, their hands intertwined as they shared a single pastry, breaking it into small pieces with the reverence usually reserved for communion, feeding each other with the unconscious intimacy of people who have learned to be generous with affection. She had watched them and felt the familiar pang of longing mixed with something that might have been joy, joy that such tenderness still existed in the world, even if it wasn't hers to share, even if her own attempt at building such intimacy had crumbled under the weight of expectations and the slow erosion of kindness that comes when two people forget how to be curious about each other's inner lives. The letter grows longer as the night deepens, becoming less a communication to someone specific and more a meditation on solitude, on the strange gift of being alone with one's thoughts in a city that has witnessed 1,000 years of human longing. She writes about the ancient bridge where she stood as evening fell, watching the Seine carry fragments of light from the buildings that lined its banks like a river of liquid stars. She had felt then the weight of all the lovers who had stood there before her, all the promises made and broken, all the dreams launched like paper boats into the flowing water that would carry them toward the sea and whatever lay beyond the horizon. The bridge had been crowded with tourists and locals alike, all drawn by the same magnetic pull of beauty and history, but she had felt utterly alone among them, isolated by her own story in a way that made the city seem both infinitely vast and impossibly small. She had taken out her phone to capture the sunset, then put it away again, understanding somehow that this moment belonged to her alone, that it would be diminished by the act of sharing, that some experiences are meant to be held privately in the chambers of memory. Her pen moves more freely now, as if warmed by use, and she finds herself writing about James, though she had promised herself she wouldn't. About the way he had looked when she told him she was going to Paris anyway, despite everything that had happened between them. The surprise in his eyes had quickly given way to something that might have been hurt or might have been relief. She still couldn't tell which, and perhaps it didn't matter. He had said he understood, had even smiled and wished her a good trip, but there had been something hollow in his voice, something that suggested he was already practicing the art of speaking to her as if she were a stranger. The relationship had died slowly, not in a single dramatic moment but through 1,000 small failures of attention and care. They had stopped asking each other about their days, had begun to move through their shared apartment like polite roommates rather than lovers. The trip to Paris had been planned as a kind of desperate remedy, a last attempt to rediscover whatever had been lost in the accumulation of routine and unspoken resentments. But the planning itself had become another battlefield, another opportunity for misunderstanding and hurt feelings. She writes about the way they had argued about restaurants, about whether to stay in a hotel or rent an apartment, about how much time to spend in museums versus wandering the streets. Every decision had become fraught with larger meaning, every preference a judgment on the other person's character or priorities. What should have been exciting had become exhausting, and by the time she found herself holding plane tickets for a trip she would take alone, she felt more relief than disappointment. The rain continues its gentle percussion against the window, and somewhere in its rhythm she hears the echo of conversations she might have had, laughter that might have filled this quiet room if things had been different. But there is no bitterness in the thought, only a kind of peaceful acceptance that some stories end before their final chapters are written, that some relationships are meant to teach us about ourselves rather than last forever. She pauses in her writing to look out the window again, watching the way the rain transforms the street into something from a dream. The buildings across the way seem to shimmer in the water-fractured light, their windows glowing like eyes in the darkness, each one suggesting a story, a life being lived in the privacy of rented rooms and personal spaces. She wonders how many other people are awake at this hour, how many are sitting by their own windows, wrestling with their own unfinished letters and unresolved feelings. A lone figure hurries past below, their footsteps creating brief splashes of light in the puddles that reflect the warm glow from shop windows. The sight fills her with unexpected tenderness, for this unknown person, for herself, for James sleeping in their old apartment 7 time zones away, probably unaware that she is thinking of him as rain falls on a city he will never see, at least not with her. The Eiffel Tower's lights seem to pulse with her heartbeat, a beacon for all the lonely travelers who find themselves awake at this forgotten hour when the city sheds its daytime mask and reveals its more intimate face. She thinks of all the hotel rooms scattered across Paris where other people might be sitting by windows, writing their own letters to people who will never read them, making their own peace with the space between intention and action, between what was hoped for and what actually came to pass. She writes about the bookshop where she spent the afternoon, how the elderly proprietor had recommended a volume of poetry in English, pressing it into her hands with a smile that needed no translation. For the quiet hours, he had said, somehow intuiting that she would need such a book, that he could see in her face the story of someone learning to be alone without being lonely. The book sits on her nightstand now, its pages already marked with the evidence of her attention, certain passages underlined in pencil as if she were a student again, learning a new language of solitude and self-discovery. The words on the page begin to blur slightly as exhaustion tugs at the edges of her consciousness, but she continues writing, the pen moving almost of its own accord now. She writes about the small restaurant where she had dinner, how the waiter had brought her a glass of wine she hadn't ordered, explaining in gentle English that it was from the gentleman at the bar who wanted her to know that solo travelers were always welcome in Paris. She had raised the glass in silent acknowledgement across the crowded room, and they had shared a moment of understanding, two strangers connected by the universal language of kindness, by the recognition that loneliness is a temporary condition that can be eased by small gestures of human warmth. The wine had been good, something she never would have ordered for herself, and she had sat with it long after her meal was finished, watching the other diners and feeling strangely grateful for her solitude, for the freedom to observe without having to maintain conversation, to let her thoughts wander without having to explain where they were going or why they mattered. She writes about the way the morning light had painted her hotel room in shades of gold when she first woke up, how she had lain in bed for an extra hour just watching the shadows change shape on the wall, feeling no urgency to be anywhere other than exactly where she was. At home, mornings had become exercises in efficiency, in getting dressed and fed and out the door with the minimum amount of friction. Here she had discovered the luxury of slow mornings, of coffee that could be savored rather than consumed, of time that belonged entirely to her own rhythms and desires. The letter becomes a catalogue of small discoveries, of moments when the city had seemed to wrap its arms around her and whisper that she belonged here, at least for now, at least for this brief time when she was suspended between her old life and whatever came next. She writes about the way strangers had smiled at her attempts at French, patient with her pronunciation and generous with their encouragement. She writes about the metro musician who had played violin so beautifully that she had missed her stop just to listen, dropping coins into his case with tears in her eyes that she couldn't quite explain. The clock somewhere in the distance chimes the quarter hour, its bronze voice carrying across the wet rooftops like a message from the past. The sound mingles with the rain to create a symphony of time passing, of moments accumulating into something that might eventually be called experience or wisdom or simply the kind of knowledge that can only be gained by being fully present in one's own life. Her pen finally comes to rest in the middle of a sentence about forgiveness, not the kind that requires grand gestures or formal declarations, but the quiet, everyday forgiveness that allows people to let go of old hurts and make space for new possibilities. The letter trails off like a song that fades rather than ends, leaving the words suspended somewhere between completion and possibility, between what was intended and what was actually accomplished. She sets the pen down without trying to finish the thought, understanding somehow that some things are more beautiful when left unfinished, when they exist in the space between intention and expression, between the heart and the hand. The unfinished letter lies on the windowsill as she finally surrenders to sleep, the pages rustling softly in the breeze from the slightly open window, the ink still damp enough to catch occasional droplets from the humid air. In her dreams, the rain continues to fall on empty streets where every shadow holds a story, and every story ends with someone learning to be beautifully, completely alone without being lost. The Eiffel Tower keeps its eternal vigil over the sleeping city, its lights a promise that some things endure even when letters remain unsent and words stay locked in the chambers of the heart. waiting for the right moment or the right person, or perhaps just the courage to speak truth into the vast, listening darkness. A Paris memory. Michael rests his forehead against the cool window glass, his breath creating small clouds of fog that dissipate as quickly as they form, like thoughts that surface briefly before dissolving back into the unconscious depths of memory. The rain transforms the street below into a living painting of reflected lights and blurred shadows, each droplet catching and scattering the warm glow from the cafe windows that line the narrow street like a string of amber pearls, their light spilling onto wet cobblestones that gleam like polished obsidian. The air is thick with moisture and memory, carrying scents that seem to unlock doors in his mind. Wet stone and distant coffee, the particular mustiness that comes from buildings that have stood for centuries, and something indefinably Parisian that might be old wood or fresh bread, or simply the accumulated essence of countless human stories lived and lost and remembered within these ancient walls. The distant glow of the Eiffel Tower pulls him back through time like a gentle current, carrying him away from this quiet moment in 2025 to another Paris. Another version of himself that seems both familiar and strange, like looking at a photograph of someone you once knew well but haven't seen in years. 5 years ago, he had stood at a different window in this same city, but the world outside had been bright with morning sun that painted everything in sharp, golden detail, turning the most ordinary doorway into something worthy of a postcard, making even the pigeons seem more elegant than their counterparts in other cities. The cafe across the street had been full of laughter and the musical clinking of glasses then, the kind of casual joy that fills the spaces between words in a dozen different languages, creating a soundtrack of human connection that had made him feel both part of something larger and acutely aware of his own observer status. Tourists had clustered around small tables on the sidewalk, their cameras and guidebooks scattered like the tools of some elaborate treasure hunt, their voices bright with the excitement of discovery, with the particular euphoria that comes from finding yourself in a place you've only dreamed about. He had been 28 then, newly graduated from law school and burning with the kind of restless energy that comes from having the whole world spread out before you like an unopened map. Every destination equally possible and equally mysterious. The backpack trip through Europe had been a gift to himself, a reward for surviving the grinding years of study and the bar exam, a chance to see something of the world before settling into what he imagined would be a lifetime of billable hours and client meetings and the steady accumulation of the things that were supposed to constitute a successful life. He had moved through the city with determined enthusiasm then, trying to see everything at once, as if Paris were a puzzle he could solve through sheer effort and careful documentation. His backpack had been heavy with guidebooks and maps, their pages already worn from constant consultation, marked with highlighters and sticky notes that cataloged must-see attractions and recommended restaurants and the opening hours of museums that held treasures he felt obligated to witness and appreciate. The camera had been his constant companion, a digital witness to every architectural detail, every charming doorway, every perfectly arranged display in every shop window. He had documented his meals with the dedication of a food critic, had photographed street signs and metro stations and even pigeons in the park, as if he could somehow capture the essence of Paris and take it home with him in a collection of two-dimensional memories that would prove he had been here, that he had seen and experienced and truly lived. Now, in this suspended hour between night and dawn, Paris reveals its quieter soul to him. The rain washes the streets clean of footprints and urgency, leaving behind something more honest. The bare bones of a city that has watched empires rise and fall, that has sheltered lovers and dreamers and the eternally homesick for centuries beyond counting. This Paris doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. It simply exists, patient and eternal, waiting for those who know how to be still long enough to really see it, to understand that its greatest secrets are revealed not to those who rush but to those who linger. The photos from that first trip are stored somewhere on an old phone now, digital ghosts of a more innocent enthusiasm, probably corrupted by time and technology, fading in the way that all things fade when they're not regularly tended with attention and care. He thinks of them sometimes, those thousands of images that had seemed so important at the time, and realizes he can barely remember what most of them showed. The experience had been filtered through the lens, mediated by the constant need to document rather than simply experience. That younger version of himself had been searching for something. Adventure, romance, stories that would impress friends back home, validation that he was the kind of person who traveled to interesting places and understood their significance. He had rushed from monument to monument, checking items off a mental list, always worried that he might miss something important, something that would make the trip complete and therefore worthwhile. The Louvre had been an endurance test then, a forced march through corridors of human achievement that left him exhausted and vaguely guilty about his failure to feel appropriately moved by works of art that were supposed to transform people, that were supposed to justify the crowds and the admission fees and the hours of waiting in lines that stretched around city blocks. He had stood before the Mona Lisa for exactly long enough to take a selfie, surrounded by hundreds of other people doing the same thing, all of them capturing themselves in the presence of greatness rather than simply being present with it. Notre Dame had been different, though. Even in his hurried state, even with his internal checklist demanding that he move on to the next must-see destination, the cathedral had managed to stop him in his tracks. He had sat in a pew for 20 minutes, maybe 30, listening to the silence that seemed to rise from the stones themselves, feeling something shift inside him that he hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. The light filtering through the stained glass had painted everything in colors that seemed more vivid than real life, and for a brief moment he had understood why people built such places, why they poured centuries of labor and devotion into creating spaces that existed primarily to inspire awe. But even that moment had been interrupted by his own restlessness, by the voice in his head that insisted he had other places to be, other experiences to collect, other proof to gather that he was making the most of his limited time in this extraordinary city. He had left the cathedral and immediately consulted his guidebook for the next destination, the next item to be checked off his carefully planned itinerary. This older version has learned to be still, to let the city come to him instead of chasing after it with the desperation of someone afraid of disappointment. He has discovered that Paris reveals its secrets not to those who demand them, but to those who wait with patient attention, who understand that the city's greatest gifts are often found not in guidebooks but in moments like this. Standing at a window at 3 in the morning, watching rain transform familiar streets into something magical and new, something that belongs as much to the observer as to the city itself. The rain intensifies, and he thinks about how different water sounds on different streets, how it carries different meanings in different contexts. In his hometown of Denver, rain means relief from drought, means canceled baseball games and traffic delays, means the inconvenience of weather that refuses to cooperate with human schedules and expectations. Here it sounds like music, like the city itself is humming a lullaby for all the restless souls who can't quite sleep, like a conversation between sky and stone that has been going on for centuries and will continue long after all the current participants have been forgotten. The wet cobblestones gleam like black mirrors, reflecting the warm yellow light from windows where other insomniacs might be having their own quiet communion with the night, their own reckonings with memory and possibility. He wonders if any of them are also thinking about previous visits, other versions of themselves that once walked these same streets with different hopes and different fears, different ideas about what they were looking for and how they might find it. He thinks of the woman he had met on that first trip, another traveler staying in the same small hotel near the Marais. Rebecca had been from Melbourne, with sun-bleached hair and a laugh that seemed to contain echoes of ocean waves, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from growing up in a place where the horizon is always visible and the future always seems possible. They had started talking at breakfast, sharing a table when the small dining room was crowded, their initial conversation about nothing in particular blooming into the kind of intense, temporary intimacy that travel sometimes makes possible. They had spent 3 days exploring together, their carefully planned itineraries forgotten in favor of wandering wherever curiosity led them. She had shown him things he never would have found on his own. A small park hidden behind a row of shops, a cafe that served the best croissants in the city but had no sign and could only be found by following the scent of butter and flour through narrow alleyways. A bookshop where the owner spoke 7 languages and could recommend the perfect novel for any mood or moment. With Rebecca, Paris had become a different city, a place of spontaneous discovery rather than dutiful tourism. They had picnicked on the banks of the Seine with bread and cheese purchased from vendors who smiled at their attempts at French, had spent an entire afternoon in Père Lachaise cemetery reading the names on tombstones and making up stories about the lives commemorated there, had discovered that getting lost could be more interesting than finding your intended destination. They had kissed on the Pont Neuf at sunset, surrounded by other couples doing the same thing. And for a moment he had felt like he was living inside a movie, playing the role of the romantic lead in someone else's story. The kiss had been sweet and slightly awkward, flavored with wine from the bottle they had shared on the bridge, and he had been acutely aware of the other tourists taking pictures around them, of his own performance of romance rather than the romance itself. But even then, even in the midst of what should have been perfect romance, he had been too young to understand that the magic wasn't in the kiss itself but in the willingness to be present for it, to let it exist without immediately trying to turn it into something else. A relationship, a story to tell friends back home, proof of his own worthiness of cinematic moments. He had been too concerned with whether the experience matched his expectations to fully experience it at all. Rebecca had returned to her life in Australia and he to his in Denver, and they had exchanged emails for a few months, messages that grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. Not from lack of feeling, but from the simple recognition that their connection had been real but temporary, meaningful but not meant to extend beyond those 3 days in Paris when they were both pretending to be different versions of themselves. But now, watching the rain fall on the same bridge where they had shared that kiss, he feels only gratitude for the memory, for the way it taught him that some experiences are complete in themselves, that not everything needs to become something else to have value. The kiss had been what it was. A moment of sweetness between 2 people who liked each other, who found themselves in a beautiful place at the right time, who were brave enough to act on an impulse that felt right in the moment. The law career he had returned to after that trip had lasted exactly 3 years before he realized that success, as conventionally defined, felt more like a prison than an achievement. The billable hours and client meetings and steady accumulation of things had left him feeling hollow in a way that no amount of salary or professional recognition could fill. He had quit without having another job lined up, had spent 6 months figuring out what he actually wanted to do with his life instead of what he thought he should want. Now he works as a freelance translator, specializing in French literature. A career that pays less but feels more like a calling than a job. It allows him to travel when he wants to spend extended periods in places like this, to work from cafe tables and hotel rooms while staying connected to the language and culture that had first captured his imagination during that long-ago backpacking trip. The Eiffel Tower hasn't changed, of course. It stands in the same place, maintains the same elegant proportions, glows with the same golden light that has guided lovers and dreamers for more than a century. But his eyes have changed, have learned to see beyond its obvious beauty to the deeper magic. The way it stands guard over millions of dreams, the way its lights promise that some things endure even as everything else shifts and changes with the restless passage of time. A taxi passes below, its headlights cutting brief swaths through the rain, and he thinks of all the late-night journeys happening across the city. People returning from dinners that ran too long, from conversations that revealed more than expected, from encounters that might or might not lead to something more. The city never truly sleeps. It only changes its rhythm, slowing from the urgent pace of day to the more contemplative tempo of night, from the brightness of commerce and tourism to the softer glow of private moments and personal reckonings. His reflection in the window shows a face that has acquired lines around the eyes, gray threads in hair that was once uniformly dark, a beard that he's grown and shaved and grown again as his preferences and circumstances have changed. The changes don't trouble him. They feel earned, like evidence of time well spent, of lessons learned slowly enough to stick, of experiences that have been metabolized into something approaching wisdom. That younger self had been so afraid of missing out, so convinced that every moment needed to be maximized and every experience needed to be perfect, to contribute to some larger narrative of self-improvement or adventure or personal growth. This older self has learned the value of imperfection, of moments that exist purely for their own sake without needing to contribute to any larger story, of experiences that are meaningful precisely because they resist documentation or explanation. He thinks of the small restaurant where he had dinner tonight, how different the experience had been from his first trip when every meal was researched in advance, when he consulted reviews and ratings and recommendations before making any decision about where to eat. Tonight he had simply wandered until he found a place that looked welcoming, had ordered without consulting his phone or worrying about whether he was making the optimal choice. The food had been good but not extraordinary, the service friendly but not memorable, and yet the experience had been perfect in its ordinariness, in the way it allowed him to simply be present with his meal and his thoughts without having to evaluate or document or compare it to other experiences. He had lingered over coffee longer than necessary, watching the other diners and feeling grateful for his solitude, for the freedom to observe without having to maintain conversation or explain his thoughts or justify his presence. As his breathing slows and sleep begins to claim him, the rain continues its ancient conversation with the stones of Paris, and he drifts off knowing that tomorrow he'll wake to a city washed clean and gleaming, ready to show him something new about the art of being peacefully, wonderfully present. The Eiffel Tower will still be there, patient and eternal, waiting for the next dreamer to look up and remember that some things are worth believing in, that some cities know how to hold space for all the different versions of ourselves we've been and might yet become. In his dreams, he walks through streets that smell of rain and possibility, past the cafe where he once sat with Rebecca, through the bookshop where the multilingual owner once pressed a perfect novel into his hands, across bridges where younger versions of himself once stood and tried to capture moments that were already perfect exactly as they were. And in the morning when he wakes, he will carry all of these versions of himself, past and present and future, as he steps out into the rain-washed streets of Paris, ready to discover what the city has to teach him next. The Stranger's Window. Elena stands at the tall window of her temporary refuge, fingers resting lightly against the cool glass as the gentle percussion of Parisian rain creates its familiar lullaby on the cobblestones 5 stories below. The city breathes slowly at this hour, wrapped in the soft embrace of 3 o'clock darkness. Each droplet catches the amber glow of the street lamps, transforming the narrow rue into a canvas of liquid light that shimmers and flows toward the Seine. The air carries that particular coolness that comes with autumn rain in Paris. Not quite cold enough to close the window, but cool enough to make her appreciate the warmth of the small room behind her. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a late taxi moves through the wet streets. Its sound muffled and dreamlike, as if the rain has wrapped even noise in velvet. The radiator beneath the window clicks softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rain's melody. Elena's breath creates the faintest mist on the glass, and she wipes it away with the back of her hand, wanting nothing to obstruct this view of the sleeping city. From this height, Paris spreads before her like a collection of warm secrets. Windows glowing gold against dark stone, the occasional flicker of a television screen, the soft pools of light that mark each intersection where the boulevards meet and part again. This is her favorite hour in any city, but especially here. The hour when the day's chaos has dissolved into something quieter, more honest. Elena has been in Paris for 6 days now, a brief escape from the predictable rhythms of her life back home, and each night she finds herself drawn to this window like a moth to gentle flame. Tonight, however, something is different. Across the narrow street, perhaps 30 feet away, another window glows with the same warm, solitary light. And there, framed perfectly in the rectangular opening, stands another figure. Another person, awake at this impossible hour, gazing out into the rain-soaked city just as she is. Elena pauses, her hands still pressed against the glass. The stranger is motionless, silhouetted against the soft light of their own room. She cannot make out details, whether they are young or old, man or woman, but there is something in their posture that speaks of the same quiet contemplation she feels. They stand with their shoulders slightly forward, head tilted just so, as if listening to the rain's conversation with the stones below. How long have they been there? Elena realizes she doesn't know, too absorbed in her own reverie to notice when this other soul joined her in this nocturnal vigil. The thought creates a small flutter of connection across the dark space between buildings. Here, in this moment suspended between night and dawn, 2 strangers share the same impulse, the same inexplicable need to witness the city's sleeping breath. She finds herself studying the stranger's silhouette with a gentle curiosity that surprises her. There is no urgency in their stance, no restless shifting that might suggest insomnia's agitation. Instead, they seem settled into their observation, as comfortable with the darkness as she has become. Their window is open too. She can tell by the way the light wavers slightly, disturbed by the same cool breeze that carries the scent of wet stone and late-blooming jasmine to her own perch. What brings someone to a window at 3 in the morning? Elena considers the possibilities as she watches the stranger's still form. Perhaps they are jet-lagged, caught between time zones like a bird confused by seasonal change. Or maybe they are a writer, seeking inspiration in the city's quietest hours when the muse whispers more clearly through empty streets. They could be waiting for someone, a lover returning from a late shift, a friend arriving on a delayed train, a taxi that will carry them to some early morning adventure. But something in their stillness suggests none of these urgent purposes. Like Elena herself, they seem to be here simply to be here, to occupy this liminal space between sleeping and waking, between belonging somewhere and being beautifully, temporarily displaced. Elena imagines their life in fragments, the way one pieces together a stranger's story from glimpses and guesses. Perhaps they are also traveling, carrying their own small collection of experiences from this ancient city. Maybe they spent their evening walking along the Seine, counting the bridges and listening to the water's eternal conversation with the stone embankments. Or they could be a resident, someone who has lived in this arrondissement for years but never quite tired of these nocturnal observations, never quite lost the sense of wonder that makes a person stand at a window in the middle of the night just to watch rain transform familiar streets into something magical. The stranger shifts slightly, and Elena catches a glimpse of movement. A hand raised, perhaps to touch their own window as she touches hers. The gesture creates an unexpected moment of kinship. Two palms pressed against glass, separated by space but joined in this quiet ritual of observation. Elena finds herself wondering if the stranger has noticed her as well, if they too are contemplating the mystery of another wakeful soul across the narrow divide of the rue. She imagines their room, constructing it from the soft light that spills around their silhouette. There might be books scattered on an unmade bed, their spines catching the lamplight. Perhaps a cup of tea growing cold on a small table, forgotten in the spell of the window's draw. Maybe travel guides marked with strips of paper or postcards half-written to friends back home, trying to capture the ineffable quality of Parisian nights. The details feel both important and completely irrelevant. What matters is not who this person is in the daylight world of names and occupations, but who they become in this shared moment of solitary contemplation. The rain continues its gentle percussion, sometimes lighter, sometimes more insistent, but never harsh enough to drive either watcher from their posts. Elena realizes she has lost track of time, so absorbed in this wordless communication across the darkness. The stranger remains, patient as a statue, and she finds their presence oddly comforting. In a city of millions, in the vast loneliness that can accompany travel, this anonymous companionship feels like an unexpected gift. She wonders what they see when they look out into the street. Do they notice the same things she does? The way the rain creates temporary rivers in the spaces between cobblestones, carrying cigarette butts and fallen leaves toward the storm drains? Do they watch the occasional cat that picks its way carefully along the wet sidewalks, pausing under awnings and doorways? Can they hear the distant sound of the metro's last trains, that deep rumble that seems to emanate from the city's very bones? Or perhaps they see something entirely different. Maybe their attention is caught by architectural details she has missed. The carved faces that peer from cornices, worn smooth by decades of weather, or the subtle variations in the way light plays across different textures of stone. They might be memorizing the pattern of windows across the building facades, each one a small story of someone's private life, someone's dreams unfolding behind curtains and shutters. Elena finds herself hoping the stranger is experiencing something beautiful in this moment, something worth the sacrifice of sleep. She hopes they feel the same sense of suspension she does, the feeling of existing in a pocket of time that belongs neither to yesterday nor tomorrow but exists purely for its own sake. There is something precious about these stolen hours, these moments when the world belongs to insomniacs and shift workers, to travelers adjusting to new rhythms and locals who have learned to love their city's quietest face. The stranger's stillness begins to feel like a form of meditation, and Elena realizes her own breathing has slowed to match the rain's rhythm. The coolness of the glass against her palm, the soft sound of water finding its way to the Seine, the distant glow of streetlights creating pools of amber warmth. All of it combines into something that feels sacred, a small ceremony shared across the space between buildings. She wonders if they will remember this moment tomorrow, or if it will dissolve into the general blur of travel memories, one small thread in a larger tapestry of experiences. Will they wake in their own bed in some other city, some other country, and suddenly recall the night they stood at a Parisian window and felt connected to a stranger across a rain-dark street? Or will they be local to this place, carrying this memory through familiar days, occasionally glancing up at her building and remembering the night a traveler's silhouette shared their vigil? The questions feel important and utterly unanswerable, which somehow makes them perfect. This moment doesn't require resolution or explanation. It simply requires presence, attention, the willingness to stand witness to the city's nocturnal breathing while rain writes temporary stories on ancient stones. Elena realizes she could stand here until dawn, content in this wordless communication, this gentle acknowledgement of shared solitude. The stranger seems equally settled, equally willing to let time stretch and bend around this simple act of observation. Together they are writing their own small story into the larger narrative of Paris at night. Not the Paris of guidebooks and tourist routes, but the quieter Paris that reveals itself only to those willing to be awake when the rest of the world sleeps. The rain continues, patient and persistent, and Elena continues to watch the stranger watching the night, both of them held in the gentle embrace of this moment that belongs to no one and everyone, suspended between the familiar and the unknown, connected by nothing more than the simple human impulse to stand at a window and witness the world's quiet beauty. And so the rain continues to fall on Paris, washing the cobblestones clean for tomorrow's stories while tonight's gentle mysteries dissolve into memory. The city sleeps on, cradled by autumn's soft embrace, its windows glowing like scattered stars against the darkness. Let yourself sink deeper into this peaceful quiet, where strangers become momentary companions and the sound of rain becomes a lullaby. Rest now in the gentle rhythm of water finding stone, in the warm glow of distant lights, in the knowledge that somewhere always, the night holds space for quiet wonder. Sleep well.